Hello, everyone. I'm Becky Betts, Chief Marketing and External Affairs Officer with A Better Chicago. Thank you for spending your lunch today with us for this very special series of conversations. We hope you leave today's program with a better understanding of ideas to support Chicago's youth. Because now, more than ever, innovations that support the whole child with a combination of mental and social-emotional supports are critical. Before we kick off today's conversation, I'd like to share a short video on why A Better Chicago exists and how our model works. I'd like to say a special thank you for our sponsors who have made this series possible. Earlier this year, we set out to find the city's most promising innovations to holistically support students most impacted by the pandemic. We called that initiative the Chicago Design Challenge. And we're proud to share that we found several bold, promising innovations to bring into our portfolio and support with financial and management guidance. Today, we bring to you a sampling of those program leaders alongside some of our longstanding leaders and subject matter experts so that you can learn firsthand about innovative solutions to the most complex issues facing our youth today. If you're joining us today, that means you share in our belief that we all can be a part of building a better Chicago where all our youth can thrive. As the first part in a two-part series, today's discussion will focus on how local leaders and local organizations are stepping up to ensure our students have the mental health and social-emotional supports they need to thrive. I'm honored to introduce our moderator for today's discussion, Rick Estrada. Rick is the CEO of Metropolitan Family Services and a long-standing board member of A Better Chicago's Board of Directors. Rick, I'll let you take it from here.
Well, thank you so much, Becky, and it's a pleasure for me to be here today. Today, we want to focus on solutions and innovations versus belaboring all the ways in which our kids have been challenged over the past 18 months. Now, that's not to say that I want to minimize that or that's not important. Because in the banking world and finance, professionals understand the benefit of compounding interest. In our communities where we have actively disinvested over the years, we should understand the impacts of underinvesting. And so there are some consequences and trauma that are the impacts. I'm excited to moderate this conversation that we hope will demystify some of the ways all of us can join forces and to help our youth be stronger and live a better life in this new normal. So I'm going to introduce the organizations and the leaders that are going to be with me on this panel now. With me, Bessie Alcantara, who's Executive Director of Alternatives, Inc. Dr. Colleen Cicchetti, Executive Director of Lurie's Center for Childhood Resilience. Karen Foley, who's President and CEO of JPA. And Marshall Hatch, who's co-founder and Executive Director of MAAFA Redemption Project. So I'm going to begin this conversation quickly by going to Dr. Cicchetti. And I think I'm going to be stuck calling her Dr. Cicchetti because I can't get it out of my mind, Colleen. So you're going to have to just endure with that. So you've been working with youth mental health and resilience for a long time. What trends are you and your team seeing when it comes to the impact of this long-term pandemic on the mental health of our children?
Well, I think, Rick, it's an interesting time because what we're seeing more than anything is an awareness of the internal life of our children and kids. I think that up until now, there's been a lot of focus on external behaviors and how kids are experiencing and acting in the world. And I think we're getting a lot more awareness of people really thinking about how people are experiencing the world is important. And so thinking through how do they feel in terms of the ability of the adults in the world to protect them. And I think what we're knowing, or what we're seeing and what we know, is that for many of them, that protective shield isn't working very well. And so they're feeling anxious, they're feeling concerned, they're feeling uncertain about their futures, and they really are looking to the trusted adults in their lives to help them make sense out of something pretty complicated for even adults to understand.
I like this concept that you just spoke about of a protective shield. And I think later we're also going to speak with Marshall Hatch about spiritual security, if you will, and I think these are two related concepts. But what are some new strategies that address the emerging mental health needs that you find to be promising?
Well, I think what I'm excited about in this moment is for those of us in the mental health field, like all of us up here, we've been trying to promote awareness of the importance of mental health for a long time. And I think we're finally at a point, and this pandemic has brought to the forefront that this is truly a construct that we all need to think about, that mental health is important, that we need to be thinking about how kids develop these skills throughout their lifetime and equipping adults with the right set of skills to do that. And from my perspective, we do a lot of work in schools, and school personnel are important, but all the other adults in kids' lives, the ones that are working with them after school, their ministers, their youth leaders, their coaches, who often have really long-term relationships with kids, I'm seeing a real interest in how do we equip those adults with some of these skills. And so it's a different perspective. It's recognizing that, those long-term trusting relationships are critical for helping kids to heal and to become their best selves. And I think that's a shift that we're seeing.
Understood. Well, speaking about a shift, I want to now address Bessie, Karen, and Marshall and ask you the following question. So what prompted you to embed social-emotional learning components into your programs, and what are the benefits that you've seen so far? Marshall, you want to get started?
Sure. So the MAAFA Redemption Project is based in West Garfield Park, and it's an extension of New Mount Pilgrim Church, which has been in the neighborhood for about 28 years. And it's its outreach ministry. So we serve young men from the neighborhood ages 18 to 30. And it's a housing first model. So we provide housing and, of course, mentoring and life coach support, education. We have a class in African American history and culture. But of course, the mental health component is the biggest challenge. And so we've really embedded SEL in all of our programming. I think it's important to note that MAAFA is Kiswahili for the Great Disaster, which references what's been done to Black humanity. The vicious legacy of white supremacy is still alive. And so on the ground level, what we've been able to do is really build a countercultural movement wherein we allow the guys, we create the space for the guys to see themselves anew and differently. And of course, SEL is all about self-concept, self-definition, self-esteem, but also empathy. And so I am encouraged by what I see every day. Of course, the challenges seem intractable at some times, but I'm encouraged by and hopeful about the young man and the future of Chicago.
Marsha, I look forward to getting deeper into that in the following questions. Let me ask Bessie if she could now tell us a little bit about your work and how you're thinking about this.
Sure. So Alternatives has been around for 50 years now throughout Chicago, and we serve young people ages 10 through 24. And I think throughout the history, one thing that's been evident is that we've always been responsive to the needs of our communities. And one of the key components of the SEL is the concept of social awareness, which I think highlights the importance of being aware of all the different things that are going on right now. And to Marshall's point, the magnified lens on white supremacy and racism and how it impacts communities of color become really important. And so what that looks like for us, we've been doing this work for a really long time, but we've really scaled it up over the last couple of years, particularly the last year. Looking at SEL, one of the things that's important, it's not just about what we're teaching the young people, but also the adults, the institutions, and the community around, right? And so what we've done is start to work with schools and other community-based institutions to build up their infrastructure to become more, to your point, Marshall, empathetic, to understand where our young people are coming from, to really be responsive to the needs of our young person, because it's not enough to just talk to a young person about the individual behaviors without acknowledging the damage that the different systems do towards our young people. And so changing our work and building on it to address policies, procedures of schools, of homeless shelters, that sort of thing, and training the adults in the space has been a big piece of what we've been scaling up over the past couple of years.
Thank you so much. And Karen, you've had the opportunity now to listen to your colleagues, and I know that you've had a long trajectory in this field, and we have run across each other a long time. Many times. And you've heard about the importance of housing first and empathy and all these areas that we as clinicians haven't always traditionally thought about. Tell us how your work has evolved in listening to this.
Well, I really love what we've been hearing. In part, and we discussed this as we were preparing earlier, so many programs today are focused on the children. And it's almost, and they're well intended to be helpful to kids. But in a way, we're putting a lot of burden on them. And kids shouldn't have to raise themselves. Adults should be doing that. Adults should be better prepared. So one of the things that JPA, we have a very old-fashioned name because we were founded in 1901 by Jane Addams and her colleagues. And at that time, what we were doing is providing probation officers. And in those days, we worked with the poor and immigrants when they were intersecting with law enforcement, had no representation. Fast forward 100 years now, as you know, we're providing mental health services, but not just to children. A lot of support to families, and with the help of Better Chicago, they are investing in a very promising program that we call Connect to Kids, where the nexus of the intervention there is on the adult, very much like what you were saying, Bessie. Because we feel that if we're putting on our oxygen masks as adults, we are so much better prepared to help support the children.
Yeah, absolutely. So you mentioned the Better Chicago, and as a board member of Better Chicago, one of the things that we know about Better Chicago is in their DNA is measurement. So their board members, donors want to figure out if we're making an impact or not. Can you spend just a couple of moments talking about how you measure the progress when you're using social emotional learning and your methods and practices?
Sure, I'll start. Sure, I think for our work, because I sit sort of as an intermediary. I sit at the Lurie Children's Hospital, an academic institution, and I work with community agencies. So I really see our work as being at this sort of intermediary space where we try to take some of the tools that we think of as evidence-based practice, evaluating outcomes, things that come from sort of that medical model, but also really look to the expertise of the communities where we work. And so that intersection point where we look at different types of data. There's the data that looks at the kids, and do they acquire these new skills? Do we see a decrease if they're having symptoms of anxiety or depression? Do we see those things actually improve if they get interventions? But we're also looking at some of those broader metrics. So looking at overall school climate, for example, looking at, do the adults feel equipped to do what they do? Do we see less teacher turnover or school class turnover if they've got the skills? Because what we hear again and again is, we are not mental health professionals. And my response is, you're not mental health professionals. I understand that, you're educators, but in order to connect with kids and to help them, be addressed as whole humans, we've got to sort of equip you with some tools, but we also have to build the bench behind you, because you're the one with the relationships. You're the ones who see changes, minimal changes. So we're really looking for the evidence to sort of support, do the kids look different? Do the outcomes look different? Are we seeing a decrease in some of the negative outcomes, some of the prison pipelines, et cetera. So we're trying to look at a broad range of data. And even before you do that, you need to start looking at some common definitions. Like you mentioned earlier, social emotional learning. This state was one of the first ones to come up with what that even was. And we now have, learning standards from pre-K all the way through high school that say exactly where kids should be. Now, we could all discuss whether or not those are culturally informed or how we are going to, might modify them. But in general, there's some real marketable or measurable aspects that you can look at whether kids are acquiring those skills. And I think we probably need to apply that to our educators and mental health professionals, pre-service, and then coming into the field, really starting to track, are they making an impact in the ways that we would like them to? And I think that's, inherent upon the folks that are doing the work to really communicate and talk with us about where they want to see change so that we can also help with building those interventions between us that are going to have the most impact in the communities that you all work and serve.
And for all the rest, Marshall, that should sound like a little bit of music to our collective ears that the researchers are thinking about this in this way. It sounds like you are incorporating listening and empathy and real science into the work, and then making sure that it fits into the context of the organizations that are providing this work. So thank you for that. Marshall, how are you thinking about measurement for your work?
Well, I'll start with this. There's one charter school in West Garfield Park. Last year, that charter school led CPS in expulsions and suspensions per capita. So when you talk about the school to prison pipeline, that's just exhibit A. So the young men who come through our doors, many of them don't have their high school diploma, right? Many of them dropped out early on, freshman year, sophomore year. Not only that, but all of the other social institutions in their lives failed them as well. And so the biggest hurdle that we have to overcome is trust. The social fabric, the social cohesion of a community like that is lacking. And so our guys don't trust anybody or any institution for good reason. What does that mean in terms of metrics? The question that we've been pondering is, how do we operationalize that? How do we quantify trust? And what we found is that we feel successful when a young man trusts his life coach, when a young man comes back after walking across the graduation stage of MAAFA, as an alumni, when he comes to give back, when he comes to engage in service learning opportunities. That bond is what success looks like. Also, leadership, and that's something that we've kind of centered on this year. How do we create a pipeline for leadership so that alumni become life coaches, become the next executive director? And I think that's what success looks like as well. And so we really have a 10-year plan with short, mid, and long-term goals. And we're in year 4 right now, and we've seen quite a bit of success. But I think, again, that question, how do we operationalize the intangibles, right? The very human things like trust and empathy is an increasing challenge, I think, especially as we are kind of pushed by organizations that want to partner with us and give us money. They come with their own agendas, and we have been, I think, very good about pushing back and saying, no, this is what we know and believe works.
Yeah, thank you for those comments. You kind of threw me for a loop there for a second where you were saying they're leading, and then you went and expulsions, which reminds me, I should say, of the many schools, charter or private and others, that will tout their 100% graduation. But they don't tell you how many children have been lost on the way to making it to the fourth year and then finally graduating.
They cook the books.
And so thank you for that reminder. It's very important. And then you mentioned the word trust, and it's not only the trust that you're building in your community that promotes full, healing and mental health, but trust philanthropy is a term that we're listening to more and more. And I believe that A Better Chicago is moving in that direction. And so thank you for pushing and reminding us. I'll just, one of you want to talk about the metrics issue, or we can move on to the next topic?
Sure. I think I'd like to, because I really appreciate Marshall's comment about trust and relationship. And that is a very difficult thing sometimes to measure, but you know it when you see it. But the program that ABC is invested in with us does have a measurement model. And what's so interesting, and just to describe what this is, C2K, Connect to Kids, is where we go and do classroom observations. We work with teachers weekly in a consultation. It's not therapy, but I bet it feels like therapy sometimes. And then we also do some classroom groups where we're modeling for the teacher. So here's what we found out. We found out that at the end of our 3-year pilot, which concluded around 2018, that over 80% of the teachers said that they were feeling more empowered to work with kids. Their relationships with children were improving. Their relationships with parents were improving. And they were happier. Their stress levels came down. And because of that, they had more instructional time. So I think what we're doing is very much like what you're doing. We are listening to the practitioners, to the teachers directly, and asking them to give us that feedback. But that's not the statistic or the KPI. That was an eye-popper for me. What we found in this program is that teachers who were getting this support were able to work with children in such a way that the same percentage of those kids who were the focus of consultation, kids with very challenging behaviors, were improving at the very same rate as kids in therapy. Who changed? Right? And so, the kid improved, and that's so exciting, and it's important, because we want more young people going to Marshall's program and working with you that feel whole and not harmed. But it's so important to remember to build the capacity inside the school. And you can measure that, but we have to trust the people who are telling us how it's working.
Thank you. And Bessie, anything you want to add on the measurement side?
Yeah, I think for us, it's echoing Marshall's sentiments around what it's like to work with the young people. And so I want to add what it feels like on the adult side as well. I think, we've done a lot of the work, such as like what it looks. We have had a lot of success with schools that we work with in decreasing suspension and expulsion, and also measure teacher satisfaction to go with it to see if we're successful, right? But then there's this other side that we're also trying to figure out how to measure. For example, when a teacher's implicit bias shows up in the classroom and they finally start to look at that become aware of it, right? So that they can start looking at that young person differently. Or when a principal is not bought into other methodologies that are not punitive, because they just see these kids as needing a harder hand, and now all of a sudden they're like willing to listen to us, right? Those are the things that are more towards like prevention type work that is so difficult to capture. And I think that I would like to see more conversation go around that. And so that, because these are very real stories that are successes, but don't necessarily translate into the hard metrics that we like to see to know that our programs are successful.
Yeah.
Could I just add one piece? I would really encourage the community to look at the research that's already there. Like the fact that you're talking about having to prove this, we don't need to do that. That research is already out there, right? So you look at Bob Pianta at the University of Virginia. He has proven through his extensive research that positive relationships make a significant difference, and they're a predictor of social, emotional, and even academic success all the way through elementary school if you start early. So I think those KPIs are already there. Our challenge is, how do you build those positive relationships? And so I really appreciate the conversation about being more expansive in how we think about what adults bring into the equation with kids, their own untreated trauma, for example.
Wonderful, thank you. And I would just plug Dr. Colleen Cicchetti has published many
That's right.
pieces of literature and research that also.
That's right. That's right, Colleen.
Thank you. I'm going to switch gears a little bit here for a second and say that in some ways the pandemic has brought the issues of mental health to the fore, because we've been spending a lot of time at home. We've witnessed our children, our partners, our elders deal with increased mental health issues. At the same time, we've seen in the media, certainly lately with Britney Spears, but before her, people like Dwayne Johnson from the Chicago Bears, Brandon Marshall, you remember him, and when he came out with his mental health issues. So it's clearly there's an opportunity, a greater awareness. But I guess the premise is awareness enough? Because, it's enough to know, and it's enough that it's accepted now by a broader, share of the market. I assume you're going to say it's not, right? Awareness is not enough. So what has to happen next? What needs to change? How do we need to fund this? Do we fund intervention only? Are we funding prevention? And let me come to you first.
I'll start with a public health approach, right? We know that awareness sits at that universal level. So if we can start with that premise that it really is important for everyone to have these skills, and that we need to think differently about how we train everyone from early childhood all the way through all the adult serving systems in our country to do that kind of acknowledgement of people's lived experience, and to be able to be aware and to welcome them into your space with a welcoming, caring approach, that is fundamental and needs to be applied universally. But then after that, what we really need to be thinking about is how do we build a workforce, language for us to be having the conversation that says, if Rick's not doing well in our system, not what's wrong with Rick, but what does our system need to do differently so that we can identify you sooner, figure out what it is that you need, help you to get that in the places where you live, learn, and play. And then if that doesn't work, then make sure that the sort of fabric, our social fabric, builds around you so that the people who care about you can connect you to the right services. And that's what a public health approach is. It doesn't mean just putting it all at universal and then these really high-end services. We could spend all day here today talking about changes in insurance reimbursement and medical insurance and how we might want to think differently about how we reimburse treatment. But mostly what we need to think about is, where are we building community, with whom and how, and who are the right people to equip with those skills? So someone like Karen's work, where she's talking about parents, right? Who is connecting babies and their parents and setting those parents up for success? And if we're doing that from a societal perspective, we're investing in folks having time with their children, that could be a positive coming out of this pandemic. Mm-hmm. You see more families walking together, having meals together, spending time together than we have seen in this country in a long, long time. And people are saying, wait, this is important. I'm learning about my kids in a way I never did before. Maybe my workplace should shift so I can be home and do this with my kids more often, right? So we're seeing kind of our values being played out at so many different levels. And from my perspective, that's how come I got into this work. I was trained as a clinical psychologist, and I loved working with one family or one child. But at the end of the day, if we don't change sort of how we think about how we invest in the whole system differently, we're going to continue to have kids who are failed by the systems that they're supposed to be served by. And unfortunately, we all see that in way too many places in this country.
You said so much, and I'm probably going to pick at just a couple of things, or ask to expound, our panel to expound on a couple of things. But there are elements of mental health equity and equity in general that you talked about. As a country, and we learn how to work in this hybrid model, it's clear that those who have worked in offices have been afforded the opportunity to work in this new model. But those that are on the front lines, mm-hmm. whether they are teachers, the highly educated educators, or they are our grocery store, employees, they're not afforded that same. So there's an equity issue there as well. Mm-hmm. If you say we found benefits of being home together, but what about them? Right. And what have you found on the equity side Bessie, you want to take that on?
Yeah, and I mean, when you first asked the question, the thing that stood out to me about awareness is that the increase in awareness does not have an equity lens applied to it. And I think if we talk, one thing that stood out to me immediately was the Sha'Carri Richardson and the lack of forgiveness of her in the media when her mother just passed and she used weed as a coping mechanism, which we see in so many of our communities of color. And so this pandemic has been responsive to a middle-class white need of mental health services, but not those who have been impacted by this the longest and the most. And it would mean the awareness feels almost performative. There's been an influx of resources to the work that, had a shortage long before this pandemic. But there's still very, these strings attached to how we do the work that's not necessarily responsive to what communities of color need and understanding of our issues and how they show up. You mentioned the parents that we're working with are not able to take time off of work to keep their family safe, or may not be able to access health benefits in the same way, or kids may not have access to internet. And so many different, it would take a complete revamp of how we punish people for using drugs, to really start to get at what is wrong with our mental health system. And I think that right now, the safe conversation is we're all experiencing mental health trauma, but we're not getting into the nuances of what this should look like to really make a difference.
And you make some really impactful and important points. I read just yesterday that 60% of the young people in America who have depression are not getting treatment. Mm-hmm. Again, speaks to equity issues. Surprise, surprise, many of them are children of color. So let's just dig into the equity issue a little bit more. Marshall, you want to take on this?
Yeah, I think it's about community health, and more specifically, community health infrastructure. I think the pandemic has revealed what's been happening already. And again, back to a hyper-local level, West Garfield Park and the city. We know that the last mayoral administration shuttered 50% of mental health institutions, most of them on the south and west side. And West Garfield Park was impacted by that. And so what we've done is partner with organizations like Westside United, of course, Rush Hospital, Erie, to train some of our young men in community health work. So creating pathways, but also education. And we've also engaged in bringing a federally qualified health center to West Garfield Park, because we know that that will be a catalyst for economic development, other forms of development, including housing. So the ultimate vaccine is indeed community health infrastructure. And as the scripture says, the last should be first when it comes to policy and funding. Those neighborhoods, those communities that were impacted even before the pandemic, and the pandemic just exacerbated those, we should flood those neighborhoods with resources around community health, including mental health.
Thank you. And Karen, would you like to?
Yeah, I would say that a step towards equity was telehealth this past year and a half. And it was remarkable to us. It turns out when we're calling a home asking to speak to a 5-year-old or a 10-year-old or a 14-year-old child, the parent wants to know who you are. And this is different than signing a consent form. And what happened over time is that parents started talking to our therapists. And so our therapy cases just almost doubled. I think that's a really important thing. Why? Because we were meeting them where they are. So we had a lot of parents who were, on the front lines. And that was really hard for them, trying to take care of their kids, homeschooling. What if they lost their job? There were just so many pressures on top of all the trauma that already exists in the community. And telehealth was a really easy way to connect with mental health specialists. Our challenge now that kids are back in school, and we're very happy that that's the case, is how do we maintain those relationships? And I'm so pleased that the governor signed legislation that allows us to continue to provide telehealth. I think we'll have to see, but I'm very hopeful that it helps us meet people where they are.
And I would jump in and just say that that's such a perfect example of something that for those of us that have been talking about equity and access in mental health, we've been saying we need telehealth to be approved. And we thought it was a 15-year goal, right? Or 5 if we were lucky, and then it happened overnight. And so I do think there's a moment of crisis that leads to an openness to try new solutions that we do have to sort of jump into right now, because telehealth was not going to be approved. And telehealth could still be taken away because a lot of folks are spending a lot of money on insurance benefits for telehealth. It's also not perfect. Not everybody can access it, like you mentioned. Not everybody has all of those things. But it's a reminder that when systems are forced to work differently, we can do it. And I think sometimes in mental health and community health, we get so stuck in thinking that's impossible, right? We can't fix that. And yet this community health worker model that Marshall was talking about, we're seeing so much interest. And we're seeing it across the spectrum with young people all the way through. And they're going in and they're having conversations about vaccines, but they're also talking about mental health. And they're talking about STDs. And they're talking about how do you access, government benefits. So populations that I work with, for example, the refugee and immigrant families that I work with, they are saying, we are learning about things that exist in this culture that can support us that we didn't know before. And it's because of this investment in community health workers. So I do think this moment of sort of willingness to say, okay, what we were doing wasn't working, but we're not just stuck anymore. We have to actually do it. So all of these folks that have been doing school-based and community-based work for 25 years, now people are paying attention to it in a way that they just weren't before. And so you hope that we can continue to bring that sort of solution-based approach and energy to challenge the systems and say what you thought couldn't happen actually can. Yeah. And what are we going to do differently to make sure that that continues?
Can I just add, I love your point about challenging the system. So I want to, kind of jump off Marshall's point around this community health issue. And a thing that we don't talk about enough when we talk about mental health being community health. And that's that paying a livable wage is community health. Making sure there's enough jobs is community health. Giving your employers access to health benefits is community health. And so all of these different things, if we actually built up and invested in our communities, there would be less trauma in general. A balanced media would do wonders for mental health, and it's things that we don't actually talk about in the same vein, and we look at them as separate issues. But all of these, if we actually worked on building these, I keep going back to the same thing, all these other supports around our young people, there wouldn't be a need for the mental health services in the same way.
It reminds me of a comment that is sometimes attributed to a former mayor here, is don't let a crisis go to waste, and which we know it's not his original thought. But certainly in the mental health arena, we have seen technology allow us to reach people, but it brings me back to the equity issue again. And I hate to just keep coming back to the equity issue, because of course, if you have broadband in your community, if you have full Wi-Fi and accessibility, then you could access this new technology easier. But what if you don't, is really the question. What if you're in a community on the Southwest, South Side, West Side, and you don't have access? And we've heard multiple stories of people trying to learn, all kind of gathered around a phone so they could listen to the class going on. And then, of course, we have efforts getting computers and technologies out there. But it reminds me of the equity issue once again. And so while, yes, there's great opportunities in technology, we didn't let a crisis go to waste. We developed new techniques, new ways. The technology community huddled, they developed new interventions. But what about the equity issue? And I think it's just something that, as practitioners, we all need to continue to consider and then push legislators and funders to make sure that if we're really going to talk equity in mental health, then we have to have, disproportionate investment in our communities of greatest need. Right. So sorry for the
it's long... exactly what he was saying, though, right? It's not everybody getting the same thing. Actually, it isn't.
That's right.
It is putting the investments where we know they're needed and where we knew they were needed before. And it goes back to the idea we were talking about a couple of days ago as we prepared for this, that lots of people are talking about that this pandemic has been traumatic. And it indeed has been stressful for the majority of people. We've all lost important kind of experiences. We've lost our normal routines. We've lost some of the sort of markers. But it hasn't been equitable. So in fact, there are people who've had experience that has moved from stressful to traumatic stress or toxic stress. So the toxic stress is for the people who are homeless, the people who've had job insecurity, food insecurity, domestic violence going on. And then there's actual trauma, people who've lost loved ones and haven't been able to say goodbye, or who've been caught up in all the violence that we're seeing in our city. So while we want to talk about this sort of increasing awareness that we've all had a shared experience of stress, we also have to acknowledge that it hasn't been equitable and that the investments and the resources to actually address this have to be distributed into the spaces and places where people need it the most, and the investments like you were talking about, the workforce. Who are the young people we want to train? It's not that we just need a bigger workforce for mental health, which we do. But what we really need is a workforce that reflects the communities and where we're really investing in all these young people who are talking about mental health to become the next generation of mental health providers. Exactly. It's a whole different way of thinking.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I know we could talk about the equity issue for a long time. We could have a whole panel on the equity issues here. But I want to switch over to some of the solutions that we are seeing now. So let me just say, there are very structured solutions out there that use curriculum. They're curriculum-based, and they're from early childhood to, seniors. There's curriculum. I know there's some interventions in the violence reduction space by, places like BAM and Ready Chicago, the Peace Academy that are curriculum-based. And then there are solutions like the traditional rec room, a drop-in space, music space, recording space. What should be the balance for community practitioners? There's a whole universe of other solutions, but where do we find kind of the healthy sweet spot for mental health and wellness?
Marshall, well, of course, it has to be informed by the young people themselves, that balance. And so what we've been able to do, we actually built a studio to cultivate music production. We have a young man with his own podcast right now. And so it's finding their gifts and cultivating them, creating the space to cultivate them. That's where self-awareness, self-esteem comes from. One more thing, I think what at the core of our philosophy is an idea of Sankofa. Sankofa comes from a West African principle, which means it's not wrong to go back and get the things that you've lost or forgotten or the things that have been stripped from you. Get those things, retrieve those things in order to create and lay the foundation for a better future. And so we've created Sankofa stories because Sankofa essentially is learning the wisdom from the past and moving forward. And with those Sankofa stories, we asked the young man, who's the oldest relative in your family? Where did grandma come from? Was she a part of the Great Migration? Interview her, know her story, allow that story to inform your own. And we found that process to be a therapeutic one, but also a spiritual one, because spirituality is just about connectedness. So it allows one to connect him or herself to the past, understand that the present is a gift, right? But also project and look forward.
Outstanding. I think about your words, Marshall, and I thought about everything each one of you has said, but when you're going back to the past to regain these stories that are so important to us, rites of passage, et cetera, someone who've been stripped from, people of color, regardless of where we originate from. Going back there, I think, as you said, really brings wholeness and healing, and that has to be an element of anything we do. The other lesson you just continue to share with us is that we have to listen to the young people and follow their wisdom because they bring that wisdom from the past as well. So thank you for that. Bessie, you want to talk about solutions you're finding as well? What's the balance?
Yeah, I mean, I think I echo Marshall's sentiments that the balance is tricky and we have to take our direction from our young people. I think what we talk about internally is it's not enough for young people to survive, they need to thrive. And if you use thriving as the benchmark that you're trying to get young people to, you think about your own life, and your own life is not just about like band-aiding all the different problems, right? It's about what brings you enjoyment. Thriving is an act of resistance for communities of color. And so how do we find joy in everyday activities? How do we bring access to something that's not just therapy, but, like you said, the podcast and leadership activities and things that really build on confidence through access to talent and skills. And so every single young person that comes through our programs has an individual plan that kind of goes at all these things that they're interested in, right? And so no two services are going to look the same because no two young people are the same. And so each young person determines the balance for themselves would be my story, my response to that.
Well, let me just jump to a slightly different question. So there's also, you alluded to this a little bit earlier, Dr. Cicchetti, about the fatigue that providers have, not only over the last 18 months, but for decades. There's just not enough of them. They're not compensated well enough, and they're taking all the trauma in themselves. And so what are you doing, what's your institution doing to support the healers, right? At the end of the day, what are you doing to support the healers?
Well, that's a great question. And I think one of the opportunities that we've had personally is that our work has been at the intersection of schools and mental health and communities for a long time. And during the pandemic, one of the things that we heard loud and clear from our colleagues in the teachers' unions, our colleagues in schools, everywhere we went, was that the educators were incredibly exhausted, incredibly stressed. The experience of zooming into children's homes and either connecting and seeing kids' lives or never connecting was so exhausting and really caused a lot of doubt and distress. So one of the things that we did kind of as quickly as possible with some connections through the Illinois State Board of Ed was actually create a platform that any educator, no matter where their district was, no matter whether they had leadership support, they could just log into this system and get some support on looking at and understanding trauma and racism and how those two go together, at their own adult SEL, at looking at how do they think differently and connect with one another. And we've had over 5,000 educators across every part of the state log on for something. And our goal in this, we have a new project that's really looking at, it's called REACH, it's Resilience Education to Advance Community Healing, and it's taking that platform and starting there, and then helping folks within their schools to do a needs assessment, and then connect through an interconnected web of webinars and professional learning communities with each other, so they can pick where they want to grow. And I think that's really been critical for me, is this notion that our team has done a lot of work in the Chicago area, and we know a lot about the lived experience of educators and frontline workers, but to be talking to people across the state and have them say, we're hurting too, and we have even fewer resources. We don't have agencies like all of yours to connect to and to get the support. We need it. And so I think for me, it's really been our role as a major children's hospital in the state to say, we've got to make sure this is accessible to everyone. And it's got to be accessible to every walk of life in terms of people who are interacting with adults or with children, and also really think about how do we build those leaders? Because I am not an expert in southern rural Illinois, but there are people down there who really are. And so if I can create a platform that they can connect with one another and learn together, I'm going to elevate their ability to heal themselves and to continue to do the work they're doing in their communities in a very different way than flying in as the expert and trying to create something that doesn't align with their values in their community.
That's right. And Karen, Marshall, Bessie, all three of you, when we think about educators as healers, it's one thing, and they certainly are. But we also have outreach workers, interrupters, first responders, and the many other professionals that are trying to help us in the community. What are we doing for them?
Well, one of the things you're doing, and so thank you, you as ABC of Better Chicago, is investing in our C2K program. And part of that investment is helping us build a Train the Trainer curriculum, because this is specifically focused on teachers, but we know it works with adults wherever they are. And the idea here is, I once attended a service and I heard the minister say, you don't have to worry. You don't have responsibility for the whole world, but you do have to tend to your own patch. You have to do that as well as you can. And so by training the trainer, we can, just like Colleen, we can tap into her wonderful platform and we can make this kind of intervention, these strategies available. Parents could plug into this kind of concept as well. So it's early stage, but we're very encouraged because here's what we know. We know that we all have to get involved. And one of the things that we're also trying to think of is how do we bring people who do not have a lot of experience with the communities, who might be reading the press and buying into, this is so grim, this feels almost hopeless. And that's not true, because we all know sitting here that in every community in the city of Chicago, in every school, in every community, there are bright, energetic, amazing, talented people. And we don't know who they'll be when they grow up. We just want them and need them to be their best selves. And so, they could be the teacher of my grandkids. I don't have any, but maybe. Or they could be the surgeon who saves my life at one point. So I would really love to encourage the whole community to work together. This benefits everyone in a powerful way.
Thank you. Bessie, I think you're...
Yeah, I look at this question two ways. One is the external services, which A Better Chicago has definitely helped to support in providing training, mental health support to teachers and administrators. And we've seen a lot of success and a lot of interest in that in particular, like there's a high demand. But I also want to answer this from the internal perspective. So we are an organization, I think the last report I got had over half of our staff is Black and about a third is Latinx. And that's actually reflected all the way from the board down to the front line. So every single level of leadership reflects the communities that we serve. And that's intentional because we believe that nobody should be making decisions for us that do not look like us, right? And so executive team, board, everybody reflects the communities. But what happens when you hire people from the communities that we serve, those are also the ones that are disproportionately impacted. So our staff is the community, right? And so we've really handled our organization as what would we like to see from others in treating us, right? So what can we do as a job, right? But another institution within the community to treat our employees and address their mental health. And so we rolled out a ton of stuff in the last year, everything from an emergency relief fund for staff. We raised our livable wage to $40,500. That's the bottom wage for us as an organization. We rolled out paid parental leave. We added increased PTO. And so we were trying to eliminate whatever stressor we could for our staff so that their mental health was okay. And the typical supervision and checking in and the things that we already know, right? But we wanted to make sure that we were a place of support and not another stressor for our staff. And I think that's the piece. When we hire people from our communities, we need to make sure that we're not contributing to the disinvestment of our communities.
Thank you so much. We have a lot to learn from you, and I may be giving you a call afterwards to learn some more. And so, Marshall, the protective factors that you make sure your programs have for your healers.
I think it's being intentional about creating healing spaces. I think space matters. We've been able to really create a campus in West Garfield Park, which is almost like an oasis, owning half a block. And one of the buildings we bought was an old Episcopal church. It used to be St. Barnabas, and now through our workforce development program, the young men in our program are repurposing that space as they learn the construction trades to an art center. And so it's going to be the MAAFA headquarters, but it's there. Every morning at 9 o'clock, we do meditation. And the meditation is kind of like our own. So it's just not in the traditional sense of, focused breathing, although we do that. But the first thing we do in meditation is we check in on each other. So we go around the room, and of course, this is an SEL practice. Give us one word and how you're feeling right now at this moment. And what we found is that creating that healing space has kind of spilled outside of the oasis. So now the partners of the young man, the children of the young man, the parents of the young man, their grandparents are invited to the meditation space. So it's really become, again, not just the MAAFA headquarters, but an intentional healing space whereby we check in on one another and we notice what's going on. We lift up the triumphs. And I think that's important because at the end of the day, it's about strengthening families. One of the biggest concerns of families in West Garfield right now is, of course, displacement. Many of them are renters. And so not just conversations around the spiritual, but conversations around the social, the political, because we have to meet the holistic needs of families at the end of the day.
Marsha, I'm going to switch gears, but stay on this for a second. So there's so much talk now about restorative justice, integrating restorative justice practices in our combined work. You add to that the layer of trauma-informed and restorative justice practices. So now you have a whole industry in the nonprofit sector that we all are. But I'm not sure that we all are trauma-informed and are providing restorative practices. Could we spend just a little time in kind of digging into what it means to be both trauma-informed and have restorative-based practices in our work? And then I want to finish off by asking you one last question. But let's, who wants to take that on first?
I'd love to.
Please do, Dr.
Yeah, I mean, my work, I've been part of the Illinois Child Trauma Coalition for 15 years. And so we worked really hard to get people to be even aware of what trauma was, right? For a long time, we just wanted people to understand that there were things that people were experiencing that impacted their development that weren't psychopathology, that weren't something wrong with them, but that's something that they were experiencing. We had to help people heal. I think where the field has moved, and I'm so excited, is from that trauma awareness to trauma-informed or trauma-responsive, and now actually to healing-centered, which is exactly what you were talking about. So not just creating spaces that can help people to heal from how they've been hurt or that are aware of it, but to actually create a different kind of an experience for everyone who comes through that door. And I think when you talk about healing-centered, it embodies that part of healing is creative. Part of healing is finding your passions. Part of healing is actually being able to have your voice heard to make your community a better place. So when we really start talking about a healing-centered approach, it's a completely different way of thinking about what we're trying to do with and for ourselves and for everyone that we serve. And I serve on this Whole Child Task Force that was created in the state of Illinois largely through Senator Lightford and the Black Caucus. And her message there is we need to be thinking differently. We need to start with, what do we even mean by trauma responsive? So here I am, a trauma expert. I've been doing trauma work for 30 years. But at the end of the day, I don't want people just to know what trauma is and how to fix it. I want everyone to know, what do we do to create these spaces where people are healing? And we brought that definition, it was written in statute, come up with the definition for trauma responsive. And I was like, well, could we maybe pivot and talk about healing centered instead, even though I'm a trauma expert? And it was so exciting. Across the state, everyone said, absolutely, we should be aspirational. Being trauma informed is just one step. But we don't start there. We don't end there. We say, what are we doing to promote healing? And if we do that and put our resources in those ways, then the line between therapeutic and, thriving, those things, we don't need to have that line. We can think differently about those investments and think differently about who drives those changes and what that looks like to come to that space that you're building and you're inviting your family in to say, here's what caring looks like in my community of men that I'm working with, but also in my community. And I think we adopted as a task force that we are going to put healing centered front and center in the state of Illinois as we go back to the governor and say, let's go beyond. Let's be the leader that Illinois can be in this work.
There's a great precedent for this too. Remember in the days when scholarships were all important and then we were focused on getting kids into college. And then we realized, no, it's not about getting in. It's about graduating from college. Oh, and by the way, for so many first-gen kids and kids of color, they don't know how to get into their first job. We have to do more. And I think you can see now where Janice Jackson is moving and other organizations, that whole pattern has already been established for us. And it's a great one for us to watch and model after, because I love what you're saying. It's not enough to be informed. And Rick, you said this too. We have to take action.
This is actually a big one. We have a restorative justice director on the E-team, and she took the job. She doesn't like administrative work, but she took the job because she wanted to make sure that we were an RJ institution. And so we have an RJ director and we have a behavioral health director, right? And so what we've all learned in the process is that the overlap between what we understand to be trauma-informed services and restorative justice is huge, right? If you're practicing what we are now starting to understand is healing-centered engagement. And so I think what is big for us, concepts that are coming up as big for us, is this idea of partnership and accountability. And I think if you take the accountability piece seriously, it makes you really think about what is it that we're doing besides paying this some lip service, besides saying the right thing. And because to your point, everybody's saying it. And so what are we actually doing? And it's this constant question. We were talking about this earlier about how the newer generation is kind of teaching us new things and challenging the way that we think about things. And so I have a younger staff and they're pushing back on the things they want to see different, right? And so this idea of accountability, and even me as the ED, right? I have to listen to my staff. I have to listen to the community, and what is it that we can just do better? And I think when your values are rooted in accountability, you're constantly looking at how to improve and do things differently.
So I think there's maybe three concepts to talk about in this final conversation. And it's one, we seem to talk about the resilience of our children a whole lot, right? And especially in the South and West Side, we almost speak with pride of they're so resilient and so strong and all of that. But that's it's unjust to think of them as having to deal with this resilience. When will we allow them to just be children and to grow up a healthy life? I was sharing with you before this conversation that as I was growing up as a kid, plenty of trauma in my neighborhood as well. But I went to a place where I was taught, it was a faith-based institution, that in order to have a full human being, you needed all the pieces of the pie. So they created this concept of pies. It's physical, intellectual, emotional, and spiritual. And so in your work, and I know it's a faith-based institution as well, how do you think about these two concepts, the resilience of our children as an injustice, and what do we do from these perspectives to provide them the shield that you talked about and the spiritual security that they certainly need? I know that's kind of heavy and a lot, but I know you got it.
Well, I think it's important to note that the pandemic dovetailed with a racial reckoning. And to an extent, they've become two sides of the same coin. And it's so ingrained in every community in the United States. So we've been talking about, Chicago. This is really a national conversation as well, because the country is at an inflection point. We're at the crossroads about what kind of country do we want to be. Chicago as well, if we look at the 2020 census, the demographics are shifting. So we have to decide, do we still want to be ruled by a white supremacist minority, or do we want to embrace a multinational, multi-ethnic, multiracial democracy that the country is going to be anyway? So I think this question, when you look at it through the lens of our young people, we always say, let's just be truthful. We've been dealt a bad hand. That trauma that you experienced, that's real. But how do we transform that trauma into triumph so that the trauma actually becomes, in an odd way, a gift? And so through storytelling is what I've found in my personal life, My Aunt Rhoda, she passed away due to COVID complications, April 4th, 2020. And she was the holder of our family's sacred story. She was the one who created the family tree. And when she passed away, she had actually gifted me her treasure trove of documents. And I created my own Ancestry.com account because the farthest she was able to go, the highest she was able to go in the family tree was a guy named Zach Hatch. So I put that name in Ancestry.com, found out his grandfather enlisted in the Civil War 3 months after the Emancipation Proclamation. His name was Jack Hatch. And if you can just imagine with me for a second how liberating that was to me, and how it allowed me to use the pain of the past to really reimagine the future. And so in terms of resilience, I think you're right. I think it is unfair, but we have to allow it, we have to use it as a foundation. It's not the ceiling, it's the foundation.
Okay.
Can I add to that?
Please, Dr. Cicchetti.
I just think the other piece is that resiliency doesn't sit in a person. You're not given a dose of it when you were born and that's who you are. It's a muscle, and it's something that we both sits internal but also lives in relationship. So that's what I heard too, right? It's like resiliency is not, it's easy for people to say you are or you're not resilient, but actually what we really need to be thinking about is what are the experiences that you've been through and how are you growing through them with the love and support of the people around you in order to make sense out of what's happened, but also to make sure that you're not defined as the worst thing that's ever happened to you. And we hear that from kids all the time. I don't want to be known as the worst thing that I've ever done or I've ever experienced. And so when we think about resiliency, for me, it's really recognizing that it's not an internal static thing. It really is a communal thing that we all have to take accountability for too. And we owe it to our kids and to our communities to make sure that it's not static.
You and I both often talk about how trauma gets internalized with kids. And Maya Angelou, and I'm paraphrasing, said something like, the worst agony is this untold story inside yourself. And the kind of community that you're building and we're trying to build, and Colleen does at a statewide level, really helps people tell the story and reimagine what their internal narratives are. That's a really powerful thing to be a part of. And so, our story is to keep working together on behalf of all the kids who really deserve the support.
I'm learning so much. Thank you. That's
Yeah, this is a big question, right? The burden of resiliency. I've talked quite a bit about how a lot of the work we do is about basically changing institutions that interact with our young people. And so there is, for us, we see it as our responsibility to advocate for those who may not be able to advocate for themselves. One of the things that has come out of that is we have a whole new advocacy department that we're in the process of creating and developing. Silence is complicity. We have a platform, so how do we push back on every chance we get and educate others on this other side of the issue and how we can make lives easier for our young people? It was not easy for us. I think historically, especially being a nonprofit and how our funding is set up, we're not taught that we can speak up, right? And when we started to push back, we lost a funder, we lost a board member, so we were immediately punished for having, exercising our voice. But what we've also seen is a huge amount of support pouring in because we're using this voice, because there are people who want to help. Right now, we have an ear. And so I think it would be irresponsible for us to not use it. And so for it's small wins, right? But those small wins are creating a better future for our young people so that we don't have to have a conversation about resiliency in the future.
I think we have time for some concluding thoughts. You could take them in the direction you want. I know there's still the topic of faith and hope and the spiritual security that we haven't talked when it comes to clinical practice, especially if you're dealing with the African American community and the Latino community, deeply spiritual groups. How do we think about that as well? I can tell you that in the kind of like the darkest time of the pandemic, talking about 16 months ago or so, I was like, man, is this real? Maybe I'm losing my faith here. And it was an African-American man at my organization that kind of brought me back. And it centered me back into kind of where I need to be and why I do this work at the end of the day. So Marshall, I know you and I spoke a little bit about that.
It's interesting you say that. I mean, if you look at American history from the bottom, it's been African-American spirituality that's been the leaven in the loaf, generation after generation. And I think, shout out to Henry Louis Gates for his newest series, PBS, on the Black church, because I think a lot of folk have looked to local Black churches for a sense of faith. I think it's also connected to efficacy, the belief that things can change. And on the community level, I think that's another big hurdle. Can I change is one question, but it's also connected to, can the community really change? And why should I try if the community won't? And so what we've leaned on is definitely our faith. And we found that it's connected to empowerment. And so we often get the question from funders, are you beating these young guys over the head with the Bible? No. Most of the young men that come through our doors face the reality of death every day. They look over their shoulders at every waking moment. And so having conversations about what does it mean to be alive? What does it mean to be human? What's your purpose in life? I mean, these are existential, philosophical conversations, age-old questions that every generation has asked. And so we just ask those questions in this context. And many of the young men land where they land in terms of their own connectedness to the past, the present, and the future it transcends me, my purpose. And so I have to be, in order to find meaning in life, in order to understand what may be after death, let me focus on my son, my daughter. What can I do now to be a pillar for the next generation?
Thank you. Colleen.
Yeah, I love everything you just said, because I think, again, representing sort of a bit of an ivory tower here, I think evidence is critical, evidence-based decision-making, having ways to measure what we do, that it actually does help. All of that's critical. But at the end of the day, what changes, not just practice, is changing hearts and minds. And the best way to change your heart and mind is to be empathic to another person, is to connect with them as their experience, to share their stories. So I think as our team is growing and trying to bring in, a lot of the good practices, like you were saying at Alternatives, for ourselves, how do we embrace our own stories? How do we elevate stories to help people connect with one another, to actually invest in taking some pretty scary leaps of faith, right? I mean, at the end of the day, you were trained to do what you were trained to do. And if you're a teacher, you're a psychologist, you're a social worker, you can keep doing what you've been doing. People will pay you to do that. But if you're gonna actually try to grow and change to meet and be challenged by the next generation, you're gonna have to take some leaps of faith. And I think that is through spirituality. I think it's through stories. I think it's through just being with others. So it's part of how we heal.
Yeah. Karen?
All the programs in the world are not a substitute for love. It's so undervalued. And kindness and grace, we need bigger doses of that everywhere we go. So I'm so appreciative to hear about the stories and the work that's being done, because this is love manifested. That's what we need.
I love it. And Bessie?
I feel pressure to come up with something really good after hearing everybody else. And I don't have it. I've really appreciated today's conversation and other like-minded individuals. I think, this is needed because you have to re-energize to do the work. It's so hard, especially as we're also being impacted by so many of the same things. And I think what I would want people to take away, a couple of things that I would want people to take away is to see our young people and community members as positive assets to our society and approach them from that perspective, because I think that informs how you interact with people. But also, everything makes a difference, right? And so what are the things that you can do today, tomorrow, every day to just kind of make that meaningful, positive impact on somebody else's life? You don't know how that sits with people, how it's needed. But I've seen a lot of small acts in the last year that I think really go towards building that hope.
I want to thank you all on behalf of A Better Chicago. I learned so much today, and I feel like you said, I've been enriched by this conversation. When we're asked to come on a panel, you never know how it's going to go. I think this one went terrifically, and we learned from each other. We had good conversation. I have always been guided in my work since early high school with this concept of pies, that the greatest gift that we could give a child is to afford them that spiritual security, that they always know that the world is conspiring on their behalf. And if we could give them that gift, I think all these other issues that we have will start to go away. But it's a tough order, but I'm so glad that each and every one of you are committed to this kind of work. And again, on behalf of A Better Chicago, I just want to thank you. It's been my honor and a privilege
Thank you.
to be here with you.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you for listening.